Welcome back to another episode of the BioHub. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Laurent Audoly. Laurent is the co-founder and CEO of PriveBio, a precision medicine biotech focused on tackling metabolic dysfunction and fibro-inflammation in cardiorenal metabolic diseases. Having had roles at Pfizer, Merck, and Kymera Therapeutics, Laurent has been instrumental in bringing several novel medicines to market, including 9 through IND and helping hundreds of thousands of patients. He has also successfully led multiple biotech startups. Join us as we dive into his journey, the challenges he has faced, and his vision for the future of PriveBio and the biotech industry. Welcome to the show, Laurent. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks, Max. Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the invite and the opportunity to probably cover a lot more than science, which is always something of interest of mine. Um, Maybe I can tell you a little bit about PriveBio in a moment, but um, perhaps we can start with how did this all sort of come about, right? We all have interesting journeys, and we all sort of get to destinations in our own ways. And when I'm sort of reflecting here on the journey to PriveBio, it's kind of taken me way back here, maybe a little bit longer than what I want to think about, but that's okay. So, you know, it kind of started back when I was a kid. I've got this sort of idea that, man, science, biology, chemistry is so cool. And imagine the following, right? So there I was, I think I was maybe in elementary school or middle school. I don't remember anymore, but like a really simple experiment we were doing was, you sort of peel that skin right of an orange, and then you squeeze it in front of a candle, and then this sort of fireworks, right, just happens. It's super simple. It's frankly almost pseudoscience like, but that kind of grabbed my imagination. And then after that, just a series of steps, um, lots of, I would say, chemistry focus. For some reason, I kind of like the world of chemistry. It sort of gave me a way to express math in a little bit more sort of real world version of how do numbers and structure come together. So I always liked, for me, it was important to kind of understand how things come together. And so chemistry kind of became something. There's a little bit of physics in the background, but I would say my head and my heart were more sort of driven by chemistry. And so I got into labs pretty early on as a kid, and then certainly as a college freshman, sought out some lab opportunities. And then I enjoyed a little bit of the freedom also of being in a lab and being given some recipes, or given opportunities to kind of do experiments and get on with it. And I was super fortunate when I did my undergrad down in Florida that I was also in a lab where folks trusted me to get stuff done. And at the same time, they also expected me to deliver on some starting materials. So it wasn't just exploration for the sake of exploration, but it was also, hey, you've got to make 100 grams of this starting material. So I really like this idea of kind of duality, where I could think about fun projects, and I could also do some experiments. And I was getting paid also to do these starting material types of experiments. And I seriously considered actually going into graduate school in chemistry initially, but I also was really fascinating by, well, how do I turn these insights into chemical matters, into insights into biology, and how it all comes together? And in a very sort of simple way, when I was in an undergrad, Google was not a thing, right? I couldn't Google it up, but sort of I constructed chemistry plus biology. Well, that's pharmacology, right? So very quickly, actually, I must have been like, I don't know, maybe 18, so I got into college early and then kind of figured out a few things and didn't figure out a bunch of things. But one thing I did figure out that, what? Pharmacology made a lot of sense, and especially sort of in a very reductionist way, this idea of, what happens to a chemical on the body and what happens to the body on the chemical, right? So that would kind of fit the definition of pharmacology. So I started shopping around for programs in pharmacology and got super lucky, hit it off with the chairperson over at Vanderbilt, and then kind of the rest was history in terms of my graduate school trajectory, and got into the lab also quickly and enjoyed the theory of pharmacology and the receptorology, and kind of like the math of biology that's sort of underpinning what pharmacology is. So constantly, dabbling in a little bit of math of biology. So kind of developed a passion for quantitative life sciences, and really putting numbers to curves and understanding, KDs, KIs, IC50s, Emacs, all that stuff, but also fascinated by biology. And so kind of midway through my PhD, then I started to think about, okay, what's next here? And so I felt a little bit of a gap in my knowledge on physiology. So I started focusing on, okay, I want to do more integrated biology, and that kind of became physiology. And so I started looking for physiology labs, and I remember attending a seminar from the chief of nephrology at Duke. So this was when I was at Vanderbilt, and he gave a talk. Tom, great guy. And one thing led to another. I ended up doing my fellowship with him, and really there, hardcore physiology, cardiovascular, uh, you know, measurements, surgery, putting catheters, measuring renal blood flow with Doppler probes, measuring blood pressure, measuring metabolism, measuring energy expenditure, all sorts of physiological endpoints, but also doing a lot of molecular here work, and fortunate to start to also work. So I was at Duke, which is in Durham, North Carolina, and just right down the road there's UNC Chapel Hill, and there, fortunate to meet Beverly Kohler, who was part of the Oliver Smithies extended team. She was actually one of the very first scientists to publish a paper with Oliver on targeted homologous recombination back in the 90s, I think, which ultimately led to this whole field of targeted homologous recombination sort of becoming what it is, with Oliver and others getting a Nobel Prize for that. So I started to do some molecular work, also building animal models. So starting with stem cells, building the genetic constructs to then knock out, knock in, insert multiple copies, and then ultimately study the impact of these genetic recombinations on physiology. So that I felt really good about sort of expanding that set of skills and that whole approach of thinking about science. But I also got obsessed with discovering novel medicines. I literally built an obsession with, I want to go into the pharmaceutical industry because that I believed is where you're going to do applied translational science. And so that then led me to Pfizer, and then afterwards onwards to Merck, and so that's really where I was able to take that training, that sort of way of thinking about science and chemistry and biology and pharmacology and genomics and genetics and different omics, and then integrate it all, but also meet an incredible array of fascinating people, mentors that really taught me what does drug discovery and development look like, because that's not something that you find in the world of academia. I mean, the Pfizer Merck boot camp and training that I got was amazing. I'm so grateful for all these connections, friendships, and learnings. And that's where I also got my hands directly involved as a project leader, lab head, and the whole integrated value chain of how do you go from the lab all the way to clinical and beyond. So within 6 months of my start at Pfizer, that was funny. I got asked if I'd be interested in being a project team leader on a drug development program, working with colleagues in Japan. And I figured that, in retrospect, probably with the time difference, nobody on the East Coast wanted to be on these 9 p.m. phone calls. But in any event, that was my first foray into being a project lead in a big pharma, integrating all the areas of expertise and knowledge required to take a drug from A to Z. That was amazing. And then from there, just did more of that and scale that and really learn also how to pull people together that are perhaps not directly into your area of responsibility. And so you got to work across time zones, but also cultures and functional domains that are everybody's here for the same reason, and you just got to integrate all of that and work together with folks to make sure that you're advancing properly and not sort of leaving things to the side. And then after that, a few more pharma experience. I was also head of R&D for a European multinational pharma, PriveBio, which gave me sort of the kind of ultimate project manager role, right? Which is a bunch of programs, a couple $100 million of R&D budgets, and then being exposed to the commercial teams and really thinking very dynamically on how does the R&D team ultimately impact in the best way possible, patients, but also the company. I'll just mention that PriveBio being a little bit of a different beast than Merck and Pfizer because it is a non-for-profit, but still has to generate revenues to maintain its ultimate existence and its viability over the long run to impact people across the world. And so that was another terrific experience. So got to experience the Pfizer, Mercks of the world, and then sort of the more mid-cap pharma type of operation. And then after that, thought, what, this is great. Large companies love it. You have access to funding, teams. It's beautiful. There's a whole set of, obviously, aspects related to that. But I also got fascinating by, well, what about building things from scratch? And that's a whole other learning curve. And then so that ultimately led me to a small number of companies that I've co-founded, and then today PriveBio, which we can talk about in a second. So that's kind of the in between the line, a little bit of my trajectory and how I ended up with PriveBio, which is a fascinating opportunity here in the precision medicine space.
Yeah, I think that's so inspiring. Like that whole journey, what you're passionate about and what led you to what's now PriveBio, which recently came out of stealth mode. So I think that's a really good place to move on to. Could you just tell us more about the company and what inspired its creation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a theme here, right, which is cross fertilization and people. And so, I've been fortunate to have worked on a number of oncology programs, and some of them have gone all the way, and some, unfortunately, didn't pan out. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, what's become clear in a super simple way, and there are folks out there that are so much more knowledgeable and expert than I am on oncology, and at the same time, what's sort of come out of my experience in oncology here is that the precision component, and what I mean by that is, understanding disease, both in terms of the different components of the disease, the systems disease over time, and then extracting that information to then say, here's a disease causing protein or network that makes sense to go after, and then translating that into, here's a therapeutic approach that I'm going to deploy against that entry point into the disease. That's a pretty fascinating framework. And it's kind of obvious, right, that can be a successful way of, extracting actionable therapeutic entry points into different diseases. But the reality is that it hasn't always sort of been the case across all disease areas. And so moving over then to a different swim lane here, and so we're going to talk about cardiovascular and obesity. There are definitely amazing companies and researchers in that space that are all in into this sort of approach. And at the same time, I do feel like if we were to call that an institution, as an institution, we haven't really fully embraced precision medicine approaches and programmatic ways of dealing with disease and thinking about how do we categorize disease in that TA. And so that's the opportunity, right? And so 2 or 3 years ago, this sort of vision emerged, which is honestly nothing revolutionary by itself, but still this idea that, look, we've got to do better than measuring height and weight, right? BMI has been around for thousands of years. And I'm simplifying here, but I think everybody kind of gets where I'm going with this, is that, all right, we've got this sort of, height, weight way of looking at the world. And then there's all that omics data and there's all that knowledge and all these amazing, talented insights generated by incredible labs and incredible teams, kind of along the lines of what's been happening for precision oncology. So why can't we do what's been happening here for decades in these other areas? Why can't we just apply it to the cardiovascular obesity space and take that whole world to the next level, right? And really also push standard of care. And we'll come back to, the evolution of standard of care here in a minute. But the point is that, I really feel that there's a push function here that's available and upon us, which really would propel this space into a whole new era. And so the underpinnings here of PriveBio is that let's think about precision medicine and where it makes sense to be applied to different diseases. And let's go after these disease-causing protein pathways that are, supported by validating data, ideally human genetics, proteogenomics, preclinical data, and let's go after these targets. And let's use therapeutic approaches that are now married to the right, quote unquote, patient population. So I've just basically described in some ways oncology today. And now we want to do that for cardiovascular and obesity. So that's kind of the vision, right? That's really ultimately the driving force of PriveBio. But the team that we've assembled is a world-class bunch of folks. I mean, of drug developers in this space, got amazing people, researchers, translational scientists, and clinicians that have really embarked on this trajectory, all believers of the vision, and now brought together around PriveBio. So we're all aligned in our values and our vision of what precision medicine can do in CVNO. Now, we're also a pragmatic bunch of folks, and so we wanted to come out of the gates with a couple of projects where we have in our hands very concrete IP, drugs, and a very clear line of sight to which patients in this large therapeutic area are going to most benefit from our therapeutics. So that's the very pragmatic. We can be blamed for being super tactical, but that's who we are. We're an asset-centric organization with big dreams and aspirations. And so in the background to all of this, there's a whole platform and access to a lot of data sets derived from patients and of course samples. So that's for us, that's happening in the background no matter what. But ultimately, the best way to show that our vision here makes sense is by taking therapeutics into patients and having a very efficient way of getting to answers in the clinic. So that's, again, who we are, who I am. And believe me, I love big platform plays, but sometimes I struggle with, kind of this constant back and forth platform assets. So in our case, we've taken out that conversation. Yes, there's a platform, but we're all about the assets. And over time, we keep building the so-called platform, which is really about patient-derived samples and data sets, refined analyses, and being really able to leverage all that omics data that's already out there and that we're adding to in the best way possible for concrete assets. The next point here, so first we started with vision, right? And then the two assets. The third one is really first in class, even frankly, first in space. So that's also us. We're big believers in the role that biotech, and I mean biotech in sort of the 90s, 80s version, right? It's doing stuff that others are not doing. So that's where, we come in with our first in class and first in space. So we're working on unique approaches. There's plenty of science out there that's been published on these assets, but no one, as far as we know, has actually taken any of these ideas into the clinic. And so that's where we come in. And yeah, it's high risk, and we're so lucky to have investors also that are believers in this first in class, first in space approach. And then ultimately, it's going to be about us doing our job and delivering value and showing that everything that I've just told you ultimately is tested and validated in the clinic. So that's the mission. It's straightforward. And so that's what we've raised money for, and ultimately, like I said, it's all going to be about the data and showing that the hypothesis was what we thought it was going to be.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I just want to bring it back to one of the first points you said, which was the team you've built. You said you've built a world-class team, which you've done numerous times, in other biotechs. What's the key formula to success here? And also, once you bring those people in, obviously your leadership's going to be a big part of that. How do you approach the leadership side of it?
I think, it starts with the leaders in the company at two levels. One has to be genuine. And that also implies, right, that you've got to have a few anchor points, right? You got to have clarity of purpose, and you got to be able to communicate that. And honestly, I'm still working on that. And, I'm sure in 10 years, if hopefully we'll meet again and we'll replay this whole segment, and I'll be like rolling my eyes. But putting that aside for a second, I think it's super important that the leadership team, the leaders in the company, understand a few simple things, and at the same time are flexible enough to also recognize that they don't have all the answers, and that we're in this together to learn together and to grow together. So that's one element, sort of at the analytical, intellectual way. The other thing is there has to be honesty, and I'll come back to this in a second. I mean, it has to be doing it for the right purpose, and you got to be honest about why you're doing it to yourself, but also with others. So what does that mean, kind of in a corporate lingual way, right? Is your values, I think, have to be on the table, right? So I think people have to be open communicators. So I think transparency is very important. We talk about courage. That word gets thrown around a lot, and I'm not talking about the courage of running up a hill with a bayonet. That's I can't do that, right? So I'm talking about the corporate courage, right? Which, frankly, even then, it gets overused. But what it means for me, very practically, is if you disagree, you raise your hand and you talk. If you disagree with a board member, with an investor, and vice versa, I expect people to be open and courageous enough to have the conversation in the room with you and to be open to an exchange of perspectives. Because if that can't happen, it creates all sorts of unnecessary distractions and intrigues that have, frankly, no place in our sector. And I've seen it from the outside. I'm on boards. I've been on boards. I've been on companies, board meetings as a CEO, as a CXO, and I got to tell you, that's one thing is people have to have the courage to speak up their mind and to exchange ideas in a proper way. The next one is, I think sometimes, our sort of our culture, right? I'm not talking about the sector necessarily. Is we're all a bit impatient, right? And it's good, right? But finding that sweet spot of when do you go fast and when do you take a little bit more time, right? I think that concept of temperance is really important, and I struggle with it, and I think I've seen colleagues and folks around me, struggle with it. But as long as people recognize that there's not just one setting on the speed, I think it's important. And the final one, which is really the most important one, is humility. I mean, I don't know anything. I just maybe know a few things, and that goes back to my messaging to the teams, to the outside world. But I think we have to recognize that this is a team sport at the end of the day, and there's no one person here that holds the truth, because there's not one truth probably. And then second is, we're here to look. If I knew that our assets worked and I could prove it to you today without doing a single experiment, I would do it, right? But we're in the business of experimentation and not knowing stuff. So I think being a transparent speaker, communicator, having the courage to bring up the right perspectives. I think being sort of flexible on speeds is important. And then the final one, really being humble and bringing in, the right people around the table to answer some of the questions, right, that we all need answered. So I think once you've got these values, kind of squared away, and you're going to be able to find people that come in and have this alignment of values. So that's one thing. And then the final one, which I don't think is necessarily the most important, but it's definitely up there, align incentives, right? We all need to understand, how is this going to play out for everybody? We've all got multiple stakeholders. We've all got multiple shareholders that are part of this. And without them, this whole show, right? I'm not talking about your show, Max, but I'm talking about what we're doing here at the larger sector level. It wouldn't happen, right? So I think we've got to be respectful of that, and we've got to be mindful of that and communicate in a way that satisfies all of our stakeholders. And so I think bringing people that are on your same wavelength, um, both in terms of values and in terms of aligned incentives, is ultimately the recipe. And I think at the end of the day, expecting people to deliver on their objectives, you know, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, is also non-negotiable. I think, I'm not one that wants to micromanage, but at the same time, I do want to understand how people are helping the cause. Because for me, this is almost a metaphysical thing, right? We do what we do because we believe in the greater mission, and we are super privileged to know that every day we come in, we're here to help humanity in our own little tiny way. And that, I think, deserves respect from everybody, including myself, and it starts with me. And that's what I expect from the team, is that you know they can come in every day and understand that we're doing something that's so much bigger than any one of us can do individually, and that deserves respect, and that deserves dedication. So that's kind of a bit of philosophy here, but hopefully it's concrete enough here to give your listeners a feel for some of my thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting topic, and it's one that's front of mind for so many companies. And I really resonated with a few things you said there, like what you were saying about courage, and if someone disagreed, then to put their hand up and really say that. We actually say a similar thing in Avetix, that as leaders, one of the worst kind of people you can have around you with are yes people. Whatever you say, they agree, and ultimately then the best idea never wins, or the best way of doing things never wins, because it's always just your view and no one else's, and that's what's agreed upon. But if everyone has that mindset and has their say, that's very like Steve Jobs-esque. He used to believe in idea meritocracy, that the best idea always win, no matter who you were in the company, no matter of hierarchy. And that's because they create an environment where everyone can speak and has the courage to do that. So I actually really resonate with that point so much.
Well, that's great, and yeah, and we all have our own ways of I think processing these concepts and expressing them. But yeah, welcome to the team, Max. Sounds like we're on the same wavelength for values, man.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Like it's something like talking about culture. It was something that I didn't really value too much in terms of until I came to Avetix and we started this, and we all sat down as a group of people and aligned our values, aligned who we wanted to define ourselves as, who we wanted to be, and that's when it all really started to click. It was a team exercise to do that. And everyone started saying their different viewpoints, and that's when it became really powerful. I think if it's a CEO or a C-suite sitting down and going, "These are our values," and it's just three words on a wall, that's when it becomes a little bit meaningless. I mean, we actually sat down and did a culture deck. I don't know how soon, when you start a company, that you really start thinking, "This is who we want to be," or you sit down with a team and go, "What do you think?" I don't know how soon that really happens.
Yeah, it's a great point. Well, maybe just three things. One is I I wasn't like this, 10 plus years ago, but seeing words, values on a wall, it kind of like it always kind of sort of rang like, well, what's behind those words, right? I hope that there was more than just a process. I hope that it's a way of like behaving. I hope that it's sort of part of some unwritten rituals, right? So now, I haven't done this in a while. Actually, I've never put up values on a wall, but we have gone through with some of my companies, through this exercise. And I would say that there's value in the process because it is a moment in time when you sort of dedicate energy
Yeah,
to these conversations. Because, to be honest with you, I mean, some folks, and including myself, a lot of what we just talked about, could be considered as a distraction, right? In terms of there's only so many hours in the day, and what am I going to talk about all these softer things about? But over time, I've realized that it is important. And so the question is, how do you get those conversations weaved into your company's sort of rituals? And so I think beyond a process, you've got an obligation as a CEO to bring your leadership team into that conversation without making it sound like, okay, guys, let's talk about values today. I think that just, I don't think it would work with me.
yeah,
Um, but I do think it's important as the CEO to always think about it in a way where it sounds genuine. And I've seen, leaders bringing up those topics with good reasons, right? They genuinely they're like, oh, let's talk about it. But then they do it in such a way that it's like a birthday party. It's like, nah, that people get turned off. You got a lot of smart, people out there that have seen many movies, and they're going to see through that, and they might misinterpret like, oh, so today it's on the agenda. We'll talk about values. That doesn't work. I
yeah,
think, the way you do this in a genuine way is that you weave it across your team meetings, your one-on-ones, and you sort of have these seeds over time, right? That sort of are planted, and that you kind of in the background as a leader, you sort of bring up those topics again. And ultimately, you know what? The best way to communicate values is via examples.
yeah,
And so if people in your team see you behaving that way in a board meeting or with other folks, they're gonna maybe not consciously, but it's fascinating, how the behavior of a leader in a room has an impact. And it's especially true with very small teams where, if somebody has a bad day, sometimes I've told guys, it's like, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be having those meetings, because if you guys are not in the right
frame of mind.
headspace, including myself, let's cancel this and let's reboot for next week, because, you want to be showing your best self the best version of yourself every time, right? And
Yeah.
so so just to sum it up, right? I think a process, great, especially for younger leaders, less experienced leaders. I think it's a nice way of forcing that function, but then you've got to maintain it, right? It can't be a one and done. That's just not possible. And there's a whole series of ways to kind of keep it alive through a company. And then the other approach is, as a leader, being conscious of the fact that this is an everyday thing, right? And honestly, you do it right 9 times out of 10, and you do it wrong once. That's what people are going to remember. So it is, it, it is a bit, the right sort of approach here, maybe to say, is making it look easy by recognizing that it takes hard work.
Yeah.
That's maybe ultimately like the recipe here. What I'm trying to get at. It's a bit like people who have to show up every day, and the people that meet you for the first time, they don't have the benefit of having met Laurent the 9 other times, so they're only going to evaluate their relationship on that at that time, on that moment, right? So your job is to show up, align with your values and why you're here, and having a clear sense of where this is going. And so I think it's not as easy as one might think. And I don't think we talk enough about, well, how do you propagate deep values in your company? I think, books have been written, conversations have happened, but frankly, sometimes I don't think we spend enough time as leaders really sharing notes on how it is a everyday kind of job, in addition to all your other jobs,
Yeah.
with moving the ball, science, fundraising, communicating, presenting, etc. That is a key one right there. So anyway, so it's a fascinating topic. I've got my approach, but frankly, I don't claim to have the only recipe, and there are many amazing leaders out there who are doing it in their own way, and they're being successful.
Yeah, I think it's a genuinely interesting topic. And I think a lot of companies, like you say, they have this misconception that, oh, our culture is we go out for beers together after work or that kind of thing. And it's like, well, no, like you say, behaviors is almost, culture is almost like distilling behaviors. And the best example I actually heard of it was the Airbnb founder, Brian Chesky. Um, he said, say one of our values is excellence. So someone comes up to me and they go, Max, I've got this piece of work for you. And I read it through and I go, you know what, that's not good enough. Excellence is, that's what we're striving for. And they come back to me and I do it again. And I'm like, no, it's not good enough. Excellence. And then finally they come back and I'm like, yeah, that's good enough. And I do that again and again. And then I go on vacation or I'm ill, I'm off, and the company have a meeting, and someone puts a piece of work in the middle, and when the rest of the room go, that's not good enough. Excellence is our value. That's when you've got a real culture and you've distilled it across the company. And I found that viewpoint really fascinating.
Yeah, and I love it. And that's probably one of the best ways to assess how good is your culture is when the leader steps away. Does
Yeah,
that, trajectory still sort of keep itself, right? And you have sort of relays, across the company, right, of folks that have taken on those values in their own way, but are continuing to propagate those values. So, at the end of the day, it has to be more than words. And I think, ultimately it's about the leaders leading by example, and the leaders and the entire company maintaining that subtext of those values throughout times, and making sure that in the good or bad times, we're still true to our true north
yeah.
on the value front.